prior to Generation 9, it was conventional wisdom that Bolt Beam coverage for Pokemon was a desired thing, that it was a strong thing to have, and that if you had it, you could just about take on any kind of team with your Pokemon. You know, maybe within reason. Nobody was saying it was broken, right? But if you could get Bolt Beam coverage, it was usually considered to be a good thing. And even more so, it was considered to be a good thing for Pokemon who were already electric or ice, right? Maybe we're not putting it on all the Pokemon that can have it, but if you're an electric type, you probably want Bolt Beam coverage. If you are an ice type, it would also probably be a good thing. Let's talk about Bolt Beam coverage, at least conceptually, just real fast. The idea is that Bolt Beam has no real resistances. Maybe you're not weak to it, but you probably cannot resist it. Bolt Beam, of course, standing for Thunderbolt and Ice Beam, so ice type and electric type. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you're using Ice Beam and Thunderbolt. You could use Ice Punch and Thunder Punch, but the idea that both of those typings combined have very few weaknesses or have very few resistances is a strong one. I pulled this list off of Reddit. I don't know if this is entirely accurate. I'm assuming it's basically accurate though. There's very few Pokemon that can resist both an electric or an ice move. So we've got, things like Electric Steel, like the Magnemite line. Of course, they will resist both. If you have some abilities like Lightning Rod or Thick Fat, that can also help you out. But there's, maybe 10 to 20 Pokemon on this, including pre-evolutions, total, that can resist it. Otherwise, if you have an ice move and you have an electric move, your opponent, unless they have one of those guys, they cannot resist it. It will at least be neutral. And that's why Bolt Beam coverage was considered so strong. So let's take a look at some Pokemon that in the past have run Bolt Beam coverage. Now, one of the main ways to achieve Bolt Beam coverage, especially for electric types, was to use Hidden Power Ice, because usually electric types don't have access to Blizzard or to Ice Beam or even to Powder Snow, right? They have to run Hidden Power Ice in order to get ice coverage. So, of course, this limits us to pre-Gen 8. Gen 7, Gen 6, you're going to be seeing a lot of Hidden Power Ice on electric types. And Thundurus, for example, here has Thunderbolt, Hidden Power Ice, got the Nasty Plot, Focus Blast for a few Pokemon like Spidaf, Heatran, or whatever it has to face. And of course, Mamoswine it would be useful for. And Magnezone. And there you go. There you have the Bolt Beam coverage. I'm set up to sweep in the end game, and I'm going to sweep your team. Nowadays, of course, this wouldn't be a very good set because Thundurus' speed tier has been insanely power crept, among other things. But at least for the time, this would have been a threat, if not that potent. It doesn't have to be an electric type that uses Bolt Beam coverage. In the past, something like Latias has been used to run Thunderbolt, Ice Beam, Calm Mind Burst sets. This isn't the most common, but depending on how the meta has shifted, this could be used. And then you just toss out neither move as stab, but maybe, it's a Mega Latias, or you've got enough Calm Mind boosts that at that point, it doesn't really matter what's coming in unless it's a Blissey. It's going to take neutral damage, and I can just Calm Mind up on you. Of course, physical attackers can also use this. Electivire is very well known for using Wild Charge or nowadays Supercell Slam, plus Ice Punch. Yeah, it has Cross Chop. Yeah, it has Earthquake, and it even has Flamethrower or Fire Punch. But it needs that ice coverage to help it break through ground types. And that's really the main reason why an electric type wants to have ice coverage 100% of the time, if it can. Or maybe not 100%, but very close to 100%, because those ground types are sort of nasty. And this is especially true if you are an electric type that doesn't have a secondary typing. This gets so bad that a Pokemon like Luxray will sometimes run Ice Fang just so it can have something to break through. Of course, not this gen, because this gen it runs the Facade Tera normal sets. But outside of the Tera and the facade becoming actually interesting, when you just are mono electric type, you need something to break through the bulky grounds like the Sandaconda or whatever it is. And so the ice coverage is really valuable. Jolteon's another Pokemon that's been cursed with the mono electric. Mono electric is really frail, really fragile in terms of typing. Not just that the Pokemon is fragile, but the typing itself is fragile, because if I go into a ground type, I hard wall it, I hard blanket, you have to have something to break through a ground type, otherwise your electric type will do nothing. And so Hidden Power Ice is very often used to break through that. There's a reason why you don't see Hidden Power Water as often as Hidden Power Ice. First of all, ice hits ground types like Landorus, Gliscor, or even Gligar for 4 times super effective damage, whereas there's very few Pokemon that you need the Hidden Power Water for. Of course, Mega Camerupt maybe is one example, and then you could say, oh, well, Mega Camerupt. Well, how often do you see Mega Camerupt? And of course, we know that Thundurus was using Hidden Power Water in VGC back in like 2016, but that's a very rare occurrence in singles to see Hidden Power Water. It's usually Hidden Power Ice. Hidden Power Ice also allows you to hit dragons for their super effective damage, which will also resist your electric moves. So that's why you need the ice most of the time. Grass is the other option, of course, but then you're not Bolt Beam, and we're not talking about that in today's video. Even if you have a secondary stab, like Tapu Koko, yeah, I can hit you with my Dazzling Gleam, but oftentimes you still want to be able to get that one-hit KO on a Landorus Therian coming in. You're going to need the Hidden Power Ice to actually break through, especially if it's Spit Off Lando, so you need to have Bolt Beam coverage for that. And Clefable is just another example of a Pokemon that can issue both stab and run both Ice Beam and Thunderbolt with the Calm Mind set, similar to the Latios before. Back in Gen 5, we also have something like a Calm Mind Jirachi that could even do that with Hidden Power Ice. So these are just some examples of, in the past, how Bolt Beam was considered, pretty standard for electric types, and can be even used on other Pokemon to achieve relatively neutral coverage across the board. And then you can set up Sweep, or just use it to break away the ground types, and then your electric Pokemon can do stuff. Now, Gen 8, as I previously alluded to, got rid of Hidden Power, so you could no longer use Hidden Power to achieve Bolt Beam coverage, and a lot fewer Pokemon were able to have it. Yes, Clefable would still have it, but for example, Thundurus doesn't have Ice Beam, so it's not going to be able to have Bolt Beam. So then Gen 9 introduced Tera, and the Tera mechanic introduces an opportunity where I can Tera Ice, and suddenly I now have access to Tera Blast Ice, right? Boom, problem solved. I have my Bolt Beam coverage back. So you would think that a lot of Pokemon would jump at this opportunity to be like, hey, finally I can have my Bolt Beam coverage, and not only will it be coverage, but it will be stab coverage, as opposed to Hidden Power, which was not getting the 1.5 times boost from the same type attack bonus. Now I'm going to get that stab boost, and it's going to be 80 base power instead of 60. So this seems like a pretty decent option. So let's talk about what actually happened in Gen 9. So to start off, let's talk about ice types and electric types, right? We want to start off talking about the Pokemon who already have stab on one of the sides of Bolt Beam, and why neither side ended up picking up Bolt Beam as an option. So let's start with ice types, because it's all way more obvious. And part of the reason why it's more obvious as to why no ice types picked up electric as a secondary option is because originally, back in Gen 6, Gen 7, no ice types picked up Hidden Power Electric. So why, if none of them were picking up HP Electric before, would they pick up Tera Electric now? There's clearly something about being an ice type that means you don't need the electric type, because they weren't doing it before. So one of the flaws of Bolt Beam as a concept, as sort of this philosophy, to live by, that I can hit most Pokemon neutral damage. Well, why would I hit them neutrally when I could hit them for super effective damage? So electric doesn't really add much super effective damage that the ice types need. If my opponent goes into something that's going to resist my ice typing, do I want to have electric, or do I want to have something else that might be more useful? For example, if they go into a water type, yes, going for electric would be useful. But if I have freeze dry, which is an option that more ice types have access to nowadays, then I don't really need to have the electric option. I can just use freeze dry, and I get bonus points if it's a Swampert. Now, if they go into a steel type, the electric type will probably hit them for neutral damage. Yeah, if it's Corviknight, it'll be super effective, but if it's Steelix, then it won't be super effective at all. It will be 0 because electric into Steelix isn't going to work. But point is that most of the Pokemon that are going to come in on an ice type, I would prefer to hit with different type move. One that is super effective, and preferably one that's 4 times effective, if I can. So let's look at the ice types and see if any of them currently use Tera Blast Electric. Arceus Ice, nobody ever uses that. Baxcalibur, no. Usually it's gonna Tera Ground, or even Tera Ice if it's in the snow. Calyrex, no. Chien-Pao, no. Iron Bundle has Thunderbolt, I think is an option. It might not. Don't quote me on that. But it also just has Freeze Dry. It does not need an electric move. Kyurem Black, Kyurem White, neither of those need Tera Electric. Kyurem Black might Tera Electric if it wanted to, but I don't think in the Uber's tier it usually wants to. I guess it could. I don't know. Kyurem Normal, though, definitely doesn't. The only reason Kyurem Black would want to maybe is because then it can go for a Fusion Bolt. Right? That's the only reason. You have Fusion Bolt sitting right there. I might as well use it if I can. Maybe it'll help me break through something like an Alomomola. But for the most part, really is not doing anything for you in the Uber's tier, which is infested by dragon types. So you'd prefer to Tera Fairy or something. But, sometimes you could probably see a Tera Electric on that. Weavile, no. Mamoswine, no. Titan, no. Cloyster, no. Avalugg, no. Ninetales, no. Like Frostmoth, you could argue, if I have Tera Blast Electric and Ice Beam, I have perfect coverage. But I could just run Tera Blast Ground, and that helps me hit the fire types that are coming in on Frostmoth. That helps me hit the steel types that are coming in on Frostmoth, except for Bronzong. In Bronzong, I can hit either with Bug Buzz, or I could even run Tera Fire, Tera Blast, and hit it that way, right? Tera Electric isn't really beating out the superior options there for Teras I could pick. Sandslash is not running Tera Electric. It does not give it anything whatsoever. And now that we're in ZU, we're just going to quickly skim through. Nothing here. Cryogonal technically could run it because it has Levitate, but no, because it doesn't help it at all, really. You'd rather run Tera Steel with Levitate. And then, no. Lapras has Thunderbolt, but it also has Freeze Dry. And then you have the Bolt Beamer itself, Rotom Frost, and that doesn't need to Tera to achieve Bolt Beam coverage, or, whatever, because it is literally Electric Ice. So, the Bolt Beam philosophy doesn't really apply to Ice types because they don't want to hit you neutrally. They want to hit you for super effective damage. There's nothing that is immune to Ice, so it can always do damage, but it just needs to break through a few checks, and those checks they need to have a super effective move for, not a neutral move for. So we've covered basically why Ice types don't use Electric offensively, but now let's talk about the Electric type defensively. Because with the Tera mechanic, not only do you get Bolt Beam coverage, but you also get to turn into a pure Electric type. So we have to consider what that would do to the Pokemon as well. Obviously, none of these Ice types really want to pick up Electric anyway for the offensive, but if the defensive prowess of Electric were such that it would be beneficial, maybe they would consider it and they would have the perfect coverage as a side bonus. But if we look at the electric type defensively, we see that it's actually not that great. Electric defensively is somewhat of a noob trap, because if we look at it, it's only weak to one type, it's weak to ground. Which means electric actually does not have a lot of weaknesses compared to some other Pokemon. There's a lot of other Pokemon typings that have 4 or 5 times weaknesses, especially when you get dual typings. But to only have one weakness, and that weakness can be entirely mitigated by Levitate, that seems really, really nice. But if we look at the defensive helping that electric gives you, it actually doesn't pay off. So electric only resists 3 typings, one of those being electric itself. And being defensive to your own typing is always sort of this awkward thing, where if I'm an electric type and you're an electric type and we both have electric type moves, we really have to hit each other with our secondary options, which for an ice type wouldn't actually be too bad, because ice usually hits electric types for decent damage unless it's Magnezone or Lantern. But for the most part, it's pretty good, but it's still sort of an awkward thing. And electric, I could also just be immune to if I went for Terra Ground, right? Remember going back to Frostmoth, how Frostmoth wanted to turn into a ground type, it hit the fire types coming in, it hit steel types coming in. Well, guess what? Frostmoth for Terra Grounds, it also has that same exact electric defensive utility, except for now, instead of just resisting electric, it's straight up immune to it. So I can get a superior defensive option for electric types by using Terra Ground. Steel, yes, electric is one of the few types that resists steel, but steel also resists steel, and steel has way more resistances. Also, steel just is not really a useful thing to resist, because how many steel Pokemon or steel moves are going on out there? It's not usually used as coverage move, only for things like Hydreigon that are really scared of fairies. But usually it's only on steel types, and a lot of those steel types aren't even that threatening, right? Maybe Bronzong comes out and it's got 120 base power heavy slam, but it's a Bronzong, man. It's slow and it doesn't usually invest into its attack stat. You're probably going to be able to chew that move no matter what. So really, having a resistance to steel doesn't help, and resistance to flying actually is quite good, because flying types are scary. But you know what else resists flying? Steel. So once again, if I want a defensive Terra, if defensive Terra is what I'm after, then steel is a way better option. There are other options out there that I could have gone with that would have been just fine. I will say the only thing that the Terra Electric would get you defensively that isn't on this chart is that you will be immune to paralysis. So if you are maybe in the OU tier, maybe like nobody would ever do this. But let's say that you're Weavile and you're running Ice Spinner instead of Icicle Crash, and you really don't want to get paralyzed by Zapdos. Well, instead of using protective pads like a normal person, you decide to go for Terra Electric. Then you cannot get paralyzed by Zapdos, and that is true. And that's the only real defensive utility that electric has. Now, we briefly mentioned Cryogonal. Cryogonal with Levitate and Terra Electric has 0 weaknesses at all. It's similar to Electros, but you know where Electros is? Electros is in ZU. Having 0 weaknesses is not some panacea for being a bad Pokemon. You still have to be a good Pokemon, and having 0 weaknesses is not as useful as having many resistances. Let's now talk about the electric types. The electric types that want to turn into ice, or rather they want to achieve Bolt Beam coverage. Arceus Electric in Natdex Uber's UU does run Bolt Beam, but it does not need to Terastallize into an ice type to do that. It just has Ice Beam and Judgment. So in terms of Terra access, this one doesn't count. Regieleki is like one of the only options on this list that, yes, Regieleki does use Terra Ice in conjunction with its Transistor scary electric moves to punch through Pokemon. So good job, Regieleki, you're the exception to the rule. Zekrom, no, would rather Terra Fairy. or Tera Ground, or whatever the heck it's running currently. Raging Bolt has Weather Ball, technically, as Bolt Beam coverage. It doesn't even need to Tera to get that. But that's only on snow teams, and in case you missed it, Alolan Ninetales is an NU, meaning that nobody is running snow. It is not a good archetype in OU, where lots of guys want to run sun teams to boost up their photosynthesis guys. And just generally, snow is not so hot, where all of the slush rushers are really slow. And I have a plus speed, booster energy Iron Valiant that can come in and outspeed your Titan, and you're dead. I mean, yeah, it'll die to Ice Shard, but you know, you get the general idea. Zapdos, in the past, Zapdos did run Hidden Power Ice. And that is true. The Zapdos would like to have ice coverage to hit things like Great Tusk and Iron Treads and Landorus and whatever other ground types it has to face. Gliscor, absolutely. Right? It would love to have just some neutral or super effective or 4x super effective option that it can safely use to hit all of those ground types and then just Volt Switch the rest of the game. But it would have to be an ice type, and Zapdos' whole point is that it has fantastic electric flying coverage, and it does not want to give that up unless absolutely necessary. Yes, you will tech on Hidden Power Steel, or my personal favorite currently, which is Hidden Power. I mean Tera Fairy, Tera Steel, Tera Fairy. Maybe there's a couple other options I'm not aware of, but really, those are only if you have to options. Usually Zapdos wants to stay being electric flying because his typing is so good. Iron Hands actually has Bolt Beam coverage naturally, and it does run it naturally because it has Ice Punch. So you run Thunder Punch or, you know, Supercell Slam or whatever, Ice Punch, and then Close Combat and Volt Switch or Fake Out or whatever you want to run, Heavy Slam maybe. So Iron Hands does have Ice Punch, and so that would be another example of a Pokemon that has Bolt Beam coverage and uses it, but doesn't actually need Tera for it. So that's sort of a funny one. So we have Regieleki, which is the exception to the rule, and Iron Hands, which is one of the few Pokemon that actually has it naturally currently, and that does use it. Rotom Wash doesn't need Bolt Beam coverage because it's got water moves already. Sandy Shocks is an interesting one. Originally, early on in the gen, people used to use Sandy Shocks with the Tera Blast Ice, and if we actually look at the current builder, oh, this is Uber. Let's take it back to OU. If we look at the builder for this, you will see that it has Tera Blast Ice, but nobody currently is running that set. So really, you should not run Tera Blast Ice Sandy Shocks. Yes, it can have a place in OU with Gliscor and Landorus running around because they will be immune to your Earth power and they'll be immune to your Volt Switch / Thunderbolt. But if you're in UU, no, probably not. And you probably shouldn't be running Sandy Shocks in OU, which does make me sad because it's my favorite. But it is what it is. Like, technically you can run it on Sandy Shocks if you must. But even Tera Blast Fairy can be used before Tera Blast Ice is used. So this one is a 50-50, but probably not. Thundurus, not really. Like, you can run Grass Knot, so it doesn't really need it so much. And just what currently it has, it doesn't run ice coverage, and it doesn't want to turn into an ice type for much a similar reason that Zapdos doesn't want to turn it into an ice type, although for less defensive-minded reasons. Oricorio Pom Pom is sort of funny because once it turns into an ice type, it will lose access to Bolt Beam coverage anyway, because its Revelation Dance will become an electric type. Instead of being electric type, but now it is an ice type move, right? So no matter what an Oricorio does, it cannot have Bolt Beam coverage without hidden power. So we're not even gonna use our brains and break them about, well, maybe Oricorio runs Tera Ice. Well, even if it did, it wouldn't have Bolt Beam coverage anyway, so that's neither here nor there. Normal Thundurus doesn't currently run much of anything because nobody runs Thundurus. Aryu has Magnezone. Magnezone is a very interesting Pokemon in Generation 9 I want to briefly make a tangent about Magnezone while we're on the subject. Magnezone in the past was used as a trapper. It would run Hidden Power Fire and would trap things like Scizor and Mega Scizor especially. Ferrothorn, right? It's gonna trap the guys that are 4 times weak to fire, and it's gonna get rid of them. It can also trap things like Skarmory or Corviknight and get rid of them as well with an electric move. So it was the premier trapper, and it always had a place in OU because Pokemon like Ferrothorn and Scizor were so common. In Generation 8, you got rid of the hidden power. So I thought that Magnezone would fall off, but because Body Press was given to it, plus Iron Defense, it actually was able to maintain a certain level of relevance because it could get away with Iron Press and beat Ferrothorn in that way, and it actually had the added benefit of helping it beat Blissey. So it wasn't even bad. But in Gen 9, it still has the Iron Press, and technically it has access to any Tera Blast of its choice, so it could trap a number of things. But the problem is, you would have to Terra in order to get Terra Fire, or whatever you wanted to run, right? And your opponent could also Terra. And so once they Terra, if I am, for example, a Ferrothorn, and I Terra Ground, well, now I get out of your trap, and you don't really have a role on the team anymore because you're just a Magnezone. A Magnezone is not a good Pokemon if it can't trap things. Especially if you're meant to be a trapper, right? You're not Specs Analytic or anything like that. You're meant to be a trapper. You have Magnapul on this team that you're running, and now you can't trap the guy because he got away. Now, the beginning of this generation, there was a couple of weeks where there was this mass hysteria moment where everybody was using Probopass and saying, oh, Probopass, it's actually viable in OU because it can trap King Gambit. And if King Gambit Terras, well, then they wasted the Terra and you've done your job that way. But where's Probopass? It's in Zeal. Nobody uses Probopass. It was a meme, a gimmick, and it doesn't do anything that useful. Magnezone, at the time, would have also done the same exact thing in trapping King Gambit or forcing his Terra. And yet Magnezone is an RU, and it was an NU for a point in time. So let's not fool ourselves about Magnezone being good as a trapper, even if it forces Terra. Because if it were good, even if it forced Terra or killed the Pokemon it was trapping, then we would see Magnezone used in OU. Clearly, the Terra mechanic has not been kind to Magnezone. Alright, tangent over. Magnezone, though, has never ran Hidden Power Ice or Terra Ice because its job is to trap, and the things it's trapping are Steel types, so why would you want Ice coverage for that? Iron Thorns, no, doesn't really use it that effectively. Belly Bolt uses Terra Water usually for its Muddy Waters or Terra Fairy or some other Terra. You're not going to see Terra Ice. It's not an offensive Pokemon. Galvantula does not need Ice. Usually it's a Focus Sash Sticky Web user, and it has Energy Ball or Giga Drain or whatever, so it can deal with the things like Swampert and a lot of other ground types besides. So it does not need Ice coverage. Kilowattrel and Raikou both actually have Weather Ball. So here are another examples of Pokemon that technically have Bolt Beam coverage. And because they are both in the NU tier, technically, they can actually effectively use Snow because Snow is in the NU tier. But Snow has had a very up and down relationship with the NU tier, but Ninetales currently is not that great. It's pretty okay though. And I think that you could viably run Ninetales with either of these Pokemon with Weather Ball, but it's not like some amazing thing, and so you'll often see them without Ninetales, in which case they have no Bolt Beam coverage, and they're not going to use Tera Blast Ice in order to achieve that. Raikou has Scald. Kilowattrel would rather just U-turn out and let something else deal with it. Toxtricity has no need for Ice. It would rather Terra Normal Boom Burst or any other number of things rather than going for an Ice coverage. Pawmot, technically similar to Iron Hands, also has Ice Punch. But Pawmot, as opposed to Iron Hands, doesn't need to run Ice Punch because it has other things it might want to be doing. For example, it has Mach Punch. It has Revival Blessing. That's the main one, of course. And it also has Knockoff. So it's got like 3 or 4 moves that it wants to run, right? Palmot may have Ice Punch. It may not have Ice Punch. A Volt Switch is another one that it wants to run. It just depends on the Palmot. So this is what I call a 50-50. And it doesn't need Tera Blast for it. Rotom Heat is more like Magnezone in the sense that the things that Rotom Heat is tasked with taking out are usually grass types and not ground types. Electrode Hisui is similar to Rotom-Mow down below and similar to other Pokemon like Rotom Wash, where it can already deal with a lot of ground types with its grass coverage, and it actually needs to worry about other things like dragon types. So you'll see Tera Blast Fairy on Hisui and Electrode. And then if we go into ZU, we're not going to see much. Electivire, yes. Electivire will run Ice Punch, but it's in ZU, not good. Electrode, does it run in? Maybe Electrode runs Tera Blast Ice, but who even uses Electrode is not a good Pokemon. Technically it might. Jolteon at times can run Tera Blast Ice, but I see a lot more Tera Blast or Lure and Voice Tera Fairies. At least in my experience with Jolteon. Luxray, as we previously mentioned, can run Ice Fang, but a lot of them want to run the Facade, Trailblaze, Supercell Slam, and then like what? Maybe Ice Fang, maybe Play Rough, something like that. Maybe Crunch even, or Volt Switch. You don't necessarily want to waste time going for Ice Fang when you can just go for your Facade. Magneton is similar to Magnezone. Minun has Grass Knot and is a Minun. And at this point, we're scraping the bottom of the barrel. There's so many bottom of the barrel electric types. A lot of them, of course, are just the Pika clones. So what are you going to do? There's a lot of Rotoms down here. I can't believe that Rotom-Mow is ZU. Rotom-Mow has been such a good Pokemon for so long in NU and in other tiers. To see it ZU is pretty sad. Anyway, point is, looking at these, there's like 3 Pokemon that have like Ice Punch, and 1 Pokemon that at times has used Tera Blast Ice, and that's about it. So let's talk about why you don't see Electrics jumping at the chance to turn into an Ice type. So there are 3 categories of Terror. The first category is Defensive Terror. Well, we know that Ice types are terrible defensively. That's like one of the most basic Pokemon facts you could ever learn. So it should be fairly obvious as to why no Pokemon really wants to be an Ice type. So we're not even going to go into that. The next type of Terror is a Lure Terror. Maybe I want to catch a Pokemon off guard. I want to think it's safe coming in, and then I one-shot it. And then I can do whatever else I want to do. Either me or one of my teammates, they can do that. So this would be something like Sandy Shocks. Sandy Shocks needs to break through a Landorus or a Gliscor. The Landorus comes in, it thinks it's safe because it is immune to both Volt Switch, Thunderbolt, and Earth Power, but I have the sneaky Tera Blast Ice Tech. Well, there's 2 problems with this. First of all, it's not really that sneaky, because if your opponent knows it, what they'll do is they'll switch out to Scout, and then you Tera Blast Ice, and then you go for Tera Blast into their whatever it is that they decide that they don't need. And then not only have you wasted your Terra, but you've also shown your hand, and they still have a full health Landorus. So it's not really that sneaky. Now, if you were to put it on a Pokemon, let's say, like, I don't know, Alolan Golem after a rock polish or 2, I don't even know what you would put it on that would be sneaky and effective, because it might be sneaky, but it's not going to be effective. But you could technically do that, but none of these Pokemon really can do it. Raging Bolt, there's an example. You have a fast, max speed Raging Bolt against a defensive Landorus. They're Spadef, so they can take on your Draco Meteor, and so they feel safe. They come in, and you Tera Blast Ice, and you one-shot their Spadef Landorus, and now your Raging Bolt is free to Thunderclap. There's a good example. Okay. Well, the second problem with the lure is that now you've wasted your Tera. So that Pokemon being freed up had better be worth you wasting your Tera on an Ice type Tera, because now you are an Ice type. So Raging Bolt, which actually has really good defensive properties, has now awful defensive properties. Also, you had to waste Tera Blast Ice on your Raging Bolt, which, you know, always using Tera Blast on a move slot is not a good thing, unless you're literally like Porygon Z or something, in which case you can easily slot that on. But for the most part, you don't want to have to waste a move slot on Tera Blast, unless you literally, it's going to be worth it. And Tera Blast Ice is almost never worth it for that reason. So as a lure, first of all, it can be scouted. You're not as sneaky as you think you are. And even if you are, even if you take somebody off guard and you have some 1800s player raging at you about how, oh, your set is suboptimal. Okay, well, that's fine. I KO'd your Pokemon, so now who's laughing? Well, at the end of the day, maybe if that was the end of the game, they can't come back from that. But a lot of times you've given up too much. And in this case, what you've given up is your good typing or terrible typing, which is Mono Ice. So probably not good. The third option or categories for Tera is an offensive Tera. In this instance, I'm not trying to lure my opponent. I don't care if they know that I've Tera Iced or that I have Tera Blast Ice. I don't really care. All they need to know is that they can't switch in to either electric or ice. And if that's the case, then I can just do it without recourse. So Sandy Shocks, if Sandy Shocks switched its special attack and speed so that it were 121 base speed, so it was actually really fast, like Roaring Moon levels fast, right? And Sandy Shocks had Nasty Plot, then Sandy Shocks would not be a lure, it would be a sweeper. And if you had that, then it would be valuable to use Tera Ice, because you'd have Earth Power for Steel types, you would have Thunderbolt for most things, and even things like Corviknight, right? And you'd have Ice for the ground types. But 101 base speed, you're not outspeeding tons of things. You're not outspeeding Ogerpon, you're not outspeeding Iron Valiant. If we're playing Natdex, you know, you're not outspeeding things like Kartana. You got things like Latios, right? Anything that's base 105, 110, 120, and there's lots of them in OU, Dragapult, stuff like that, you're not outspeeding them. Well, okay, you say, well, I'm going to run booster speed, right? I'm going to be timid, max speed with whatever EVs it takes to make sure that I get a speed boost. Then I will be faster than just about everything. And that is basically true, yeah. There's not a lot of things that are going to outspeed a base 101 max speed, effectively Choice Scarf Sandy Shocks. But the problem is, at that point, you've given up all of your offensive power. Because you're not running Modest, you're not max attack, I don't think, in order to achieve max speed here, right? You got that. If I put max speed here, timid, yeah, see, it's still faster. So actually I have to take these and drag it down to the point where I'm going to actually get that power. And I don't have Nasty Plot, right? I don't even see Calm Mind on this list. So Sandy Shocks can't be an effective offensive user of Bolt Beam because it doesn't outspeed lots of things on teams, and it's not strong enough to punch holes. Yeah, if your opponent's team is all at like 30% or something, maybe you could, but you can't normally. And that goes double or even triply so if your opponent's team is bulky. Maybe if their opponent's team is bulky, you outspeed everything on their team already naturally. And that's often going to be the case with the base 100 guy. But if they've got a Blissey, that Tera Blast Ice does not help you break through the Blissey. If they've got a Spadef Corviknight or whatever, then they can tear it into something like Terra Fairy or something, you're not going to break through that either. Because now all your hits are neutral, but they're all weak. So you're not an offensive threat. You are an offensive annoyance at best. You need to have Nasty Plot, like that Thundurus we saw earlier in the video. You need to have something like that, right? This is 111 base speed. You're going to outspeed the Ogerpons. You can outspeed the Kartana's on Choice Scarfed, and you have Nasty Plot with a base 125 attack. So you can actually punch holes through teams. It's just that Thundurus isn't really what it used to be, and even this 111 speed tier isn't fantastic in higher tiers. So you're not going to see that a lot. But technically, that would be an example of an offensive user of Bolt Beam coverage. But as you can see, most of these guys really don't have that. Raikou, no Nasty Plot. If Raikou had Nasty Plot, it would not be NU. Let me tell you. 115 base speed in NU, pretty decent. But 115 base special attack, still not that good. Missing out on a lot of KOs. If you got Nasty Plot on Raikou, Nasty Plot Life Orb, and then you've got Aura Sphere, Tera Blast Ice, and Thunderbolt, it is a different story, let me tell you. But none of these Pokemon really are set up for that. Even something like Pawmot or Iron Hands that could be a sweeper usually have other limitations or would rather be doing something else. Iron Hands, yes, it's a Bolt Beam sweeper, but only under Trick Room, and Trick Room is not that good. Pawmot, yes, technically it can do something with Bolt Beam, but it would rather be Revival Blessing most of the time. Otherwise, you would rather have a different Pokemon, a different fighting type, or whatever, a lot of the time. So, that's where we stand for Pokemon who are Ice types and Pokemon who are Electric types. And Pokemon who are not either of those typings, well, they're not going to get a stab on at least one of those. And as we've previously discussed, turning into an Electric type, that's not going to hurt you, but it's not going to help you. It's a mediocre defensive type, at best. You know, if you're Latios, and you can Tera Electric and get that Bolt Beam as we've seen before, maybe that's an example where you could make it work. But really, you're not weak to anything, but you're not resisting anything, so it's not that great. You'd prefer to have something like Tera Steel, where you don't get poisoned and you can set up much more safely that way. And then if you Tera Ice, of course, defensively that's awful. So why do we not see Bolt Beam anymore? Well, there's a few reasons for it. First of all, as we've seen, having neutral coverage is not all that it's cracked up to be. What you really want is super effective coverage. So you pick your counters, and then you counter those counters with something that's super effective, not with something that's neutral. Frostmoth knows it's weak to fire types, so it does not pick electric to beat the fire types. It picks water or ground or something that's actually useful. Raging Bolt knows that it's weak to dragons, like Dragapult, so it does not pick Tera Blast Ice, which technically would hit the dragons. It hits Tera Blast Fairy, which is much stronger defensively and it does the same exact job. The other problem with Bolt Beam in Gen 9, and this is something we've only briefly alluded to, is that in the past there were a lot of 4x weak mons. You know, in Gen 6, Gen 7, I've got my Electric type, got Hidden Power Ice. Why does it have Hidden Power Ice? Because there's things like Landorus and Gliscor that are running around. They're 4x weak to Ice. It's also good for the Dragon types. But in other tiers, where there's more like Swampert or Gastrodon, I'm going to run my Hidden Power Grass instead. Why? Because there it's 4x weak to it. Well, in Gen 9, where everything can Terra, that goes for those 4x weak guys. So if I've got a Gliscor that's Spadef, well, I Terra Normal, or I Terra Ghost, or whatever Terra I'm currently running, and all of a sudden, yes, you can hit me for neutral damage. But that's it. That's all you're going to be able to do. So you don't get nearly as much value. And technically, yes, once they're no longer a ground type, then you can use your electric moves. You are freed up in that regard. And yes, you force them to Terra. But it's just not as good as other options that you could have. And we've already seen that ice types do not value electric coverage nearly as much as electrics value ice coverage. So all of these things have combined to make Bolt Beam basically vanish. It's almost gone. Yes, Iron Hands has it, and something like Arceus Electric has it. And Regieleki is the one example of a Pokemon that does want Bolt Beam and would sacrifice your Tera Blasts, or your Terra and use Tera Ice just to have that. as one example. But nothing else wants to do that. Will we see hidden power come back in Champions or in Gen 10? I think probably not. I think that the way the hidden power mechanics work with IVs, the Game Freak doesn't really like that, and they want to move away from it. They also maybe felt it was cheesy a little bit. Maybe I'm wrong though, and they'll bring it back. And if they do bring back hidden power ice, I think that you'll go back to seeing certain Pokemon, especially electric types, running Bolt Beam with the HP ice being their beam side of things. But we'll see how things go, especially if Tera remains a mechanic. If Tera remains a mechanic, then Bolt Beam is not as valuable as other things that you could have, because you want to hit things super effectively and not for neutral. But anyway, that'll be it for today's video, and I'll catch you guys next time.